She was sent to spy on him, but ended up becoming Teehee General's ward.
The year is 1868. The South still bleeds beneath the weight of a war that ended, but never truly healed. Savannah, Georgia, a city of magnolias and ash, where Union soldiers patrol cobblestone streets and Confederate pride festers in gilded drawing rooms. Vivienne Calloway is a Southern widow's daughter, with nothing left but a sharp mind and a dangerous secret. She has been recruited by a network of Confederate sympathizers to infiltrate the household of General Marcus Hale, the Union's most formidable Reconstruction commander, a man they say has no heart, no mercy, and no weakness. Her mission is simple: get close, find the documents, disappear. But General Hale is not what she was told, and Vivienne is not as invisible as she thought. What begins as deception slowly unravels into something neither of them planned: trust built in the quiet hours before dawn, a protection she never asked for, and a love that threatens to destroy everything they are both trying to survive. Some missions are impossible to complete. Some walls were never meant to hold. If this story already has you breathless, you're exactly where you're supposed to be. Subscribe, hit the bell, and tell us in the comments, where are you watching from? We read every single one. The letter arrived on a Tuesday, slipped beneath the door of the boarding house on Drayton Street, like a secret too ashamed to knock. Vivienne Calloway found it just before dawn, when the floorboards were cold beneath her bare feet and the city outside was still pretending to sleep. She recognized the wax seal immediately, not from any coat of arms or official crest, but from the particular way it had been pressed, slightly off-center, the imprint of a thumb ring rather than a formal stamp. It was the mark of Colonel Beaumont Dupree, a man who no longer existed on paper, but existed very much in the shadows of what remained of Southern resistance. She did not open it right away. Instead, she stood at the window and watched a Union patrol move down the street below. 3 soldiers, young, their blue coats dark in the grey morning light, their boots striking the cobblestones in that particular rhythm of men who had learned to walk like they owned the ground beneath them. One of them laughed at something. The sound travelled up through the glass and settled in her chest like a splinter. Not because she hated them, though she had once believed she was supposed to, but because their ease was a specific kind of wound. The ease of men who had never had to perform their own irrelevance. Savannah, Georgia, 1868. 3 years since the war had ended, and still the city breathed like a man with a boot on his throat, slowly, carefully, always aware of the pressure. She turned from the window and opened the letter. It was brief. Dupree had never been a man of unnecessary words. Miss Calloway, your country remembers what your father gave. Now it asks something of you. Come to the Whitmore house at dusk. Come alone. Burn this. She read it twice. Then she held it over the candle flame and watched it curl to black. Her father had been a colonel in the Confederate Army, dead at Chickamauga in 1863. Her mother had followed 2 years later, not from a bullet, but from grief and a winter that refused to end. Vivienne had been 20 years old with a boarding house room, a trunk of her mother's dresses, and the particular skill set of a woman raised to be decorative, who had survived by learning to be useful instead. She could read men the way other women read scripture, not because she had studied them academically, but because she had watched, listened, and catalogued for years in rooms where everyone assumed she was simply arranging flowers. The way a man's jaw tensed when he lied, the way his shoulders dropped when he finally believed something, the micro-change in a man's eyes when he looked at a woman and decided whether she was a person or a prop. The language of the body that most people forgot they were speaking, because no one had ever told them anyone was listening. Dupree had noticed this skill at her father's funeral, when she had quietly identified which of the mourners were genuinely grieving, and which were there to assess what the Calloway family still had worth taking. He had said nothing to her then, just watched her with the eyes of a man filing something away in a drawer he intended to open later. He was opening it now. She dressed carefully, not her best dress, which she was saving for emergencies she couldn't yet define, but a dark green wool that made her look respectable without looking like she was trying. She pinned her dark hair back with the 2 silver pins that had been her mother's. She looked in the small mirror above the washstand and met her own eyes without flinching. Whatever this is, she told herself. You can handle it. She had been telling herself that lie for 5 years. The remarkable thing was that it kept being true. The Whitmore house was one of the grand old homes on Bull Street that had survived the war with most of its bones intact, though the flesh of it, the gardens, the staff, the casual abundance, had long since been stripped away. The woman who answered the door was not Mrs. Whitmore, but a thin man in civilian clothes who had the eyes of someone who had been a soldier so long he'd forgotten how to stand like anything else. Dupree was waiting in the parlor. He was 60 years old and looked 80. The war had taken something from him that wasn't physical and never came back, but his eyes were still quick, still calculating, still the eyes of a man playing a game that most people didn't know was being played. He rose when she entered. That at least hadn't changed. Southern manners died harder than Southern armies. Miss Calloway. His voice was dry as old paper. Thank you for coming. You didn't give me much choice, Colonel. I never give anyone much choice. He gestured to the chair across from him. Please. She sat. The parlor smelled of tobacco and old wood and something beneath it. Anxiety, she thought. The particular metallic edge that men gave off when the stakes were high and their options were narrowing. There were 2 other men in the room. She noted them without appearing to. One young, one middle-aged, both wearing the careful blankness of men who had been told to listen and not speak. You know who General Marcus Hale is, Dupree said. It was not a question. Everyone in Savannah knows who General Hale is. She kept her voice neutral. He commands the Union occupation forces in this district. He's been here since '66. He's the reason 3 of our aldermen are currently in military custody. 4, Dupree corrected, as of last Monday. She felt the number land in her stomach like a stone dropped in still water. She did not let it show. What I'm about to tell you does not leave this room, Dupree continued. General Hale has in his possession a set of correspondence, letters between certain prominent Southern gentlemen and certain members of the current administration in Washington. Letters that, if made public, would expose a considerable amount of hypocrisy on both sides and potentially destabilize the current Reconstruction Authority in Georgia. And you want them. We want to know they exist, where they're kept, and whether they can be retrieved. He paused. We need someone inside his household. And you've chosen me. General Hale is looking for a new housekeeper. His last one left suddenly, family circumstances apparently. Something in the way he said it made Vivienne decide not to ask what the circumstances had actually been. We have arranged for your references to be impeccable. A Mrs. Eleanor Marsh of Charleston has agreed to vouch for you. You have experience managing a household, your mother's, before the war. Managing my mother's household is not the same as... You are smart, composed, and unremarkable enough to be invisible in a room. He said it without cruelty, the way a man describes a tool's most useful quality. Those are exactly the qualities this requires. Vivienne looked at the cold fireplace for a moment. The grate had been swept clean. Someone had removed the ashes so carefully that no trace remained of what had burned there. She thought, without meaning to, of the letter she had burned in her room that morning. How efficiently fire erased things, how completely. What happens to me, she said, if he finds out? Dupree met her eyes without any softening. Then you will have been a woman who acted alone, out of misguided loyalty to a lost cause. We will deny any knowledge of you. The clarity of it was almost refreshing. And if I succeed? Your father's debts, the ones that still hold the Calloway property in lien, will be settled. The house in Savannah will be returned to your name. Her mother's house. The one with the magnolia tree in the garden that had been planted the year Vivienne was born. The one her mother had watched from her bedroom window in those last months when she couldn't walk anymore and the window was the only world she had left. Her mother had never spoken of it as a loss. She had simply looked at that tree every morning as if it were enough, as if the fact of something still growing was, in the end, sufficient reason. Vivienne breathed in slowly, let the air out through her nose. When do I start? She said. General Marcus Hale's requisitioned residence stood at the edge of Forsyth Park, a 3-story Federal-style house that had belonged to a cotton merchant before the war turned cotton into something complicated. It was large and well-maintained in the way that military discipline maintained things. Not because anyone loved it, but because disarray was a form of disorder, and disorder was something General Hale did not permit. Vivienne arrived on a Wednesday morning with a single trunk and a letter of introduction that she had memorized so thoroughly she could have recited it backwards. The door was opened by a young black man in his 20s named Thomas, who she would learn was the general's personal aide. Not a servant in the old sense, but a freeman who had chosen this employment deliberately and who possessed a particular quality of watchfulness that told Vivienne immediately he was someone she needed to be very careful around. He looked at her the way she looked at everyone, cataloguing, measuring, withholding judgment until the evidence warranted it. She recognized the habit. She respected it instantly. Miss Calloway. He looked at her letter without reading it, which meant he already knew about her. The general will see you at 2 o'clock. In the meantime, Mrs. Prentice will show you the house. Mrs. Prentice was the cook, a stout, flour-dusted woman from Ohio who had followed her husband south during the occupation and stayed after he went home, because she had decided, as she explained to Vivienne while showing her the kitchen, that the biscuits in Georgia were worth the inconvenience. "The general takes breakfast at 6, she said, opening the pantry with the proprietary air of a woman who considered it her personal territory. "He eats simply. Eggs, bread, coffee. No fancy nonsense. Lunch he usually takes at his office. Dinner at 7, unless he's entertaining, which he does perhaps twice a month. He has officers in sometimes and occasionally civilian officials." She gave Vivienne a measuring look. "He's not difficult if you do your work. He notices everything, though. Don't think he doesn't. What sort of things does he notice? If the silver's dusty, if a door is left open that was closed before, if a paper on his desk has been moved half an inch." Mrs. Prentice closed the pantry with the firmness of someone making a point. "He doesn't make a fuss about it, he just knows. And once he knows something, he files it away and he doesn't forget it. In 20 years of fighting wars and managing men, I imagine he never once forgot a thing." Vivienne made a mental note that would have sounded, if spoken aloud, like, "He will be harder than Dupree thinks." She was shown her room, small, clean, on the 3rd floor with a view of the park, and the rest of the house in methodical sequence. The dining room with its dark mahogany table capable of seating 12, the parlor with its modest but genuine fire burning against the November chill, the library where she allowed herself exactly 3 seconds to catalogue the bookshelves, military history, law, philosophy, Roman classics, and one shelf of poetry that she noted as the most human thing she had seen in the house so far, its spines worn in a way the others weren't. The study which Mrs. Prentice showed her from the doorway only. "The general keeps his study private. You'll clean it only when he's present." The general's bedroom. His offices on the 2nd floor where 2 young officers worked at desks with the focused misery of men drowning in paperwork. At 2 o'clock precisely, Thomas led her to the study. She had prepared herself. She had assembled in her mind a portrait of General Marcus Hale built from rumor, reputation, and Dupree's briefing. A man of 40-odd years, a career soldier, decorated at Chancellorsville and Petersburg, appointed to Reconstruction Command because he was effective and unbothered by the social complexities that made other commanders hesitate. Cold, Dupree had said. Rigid. A man who saw the South as a problem to be administered rather than a wound to be healed. What she had not prepared herself for was the way he looked up from his desk when she entered. Not because he was handsome, though he was, in the way that men who have spent their lives outdoors are handsome. All weather and angles and a jaw that looked like it had been carved with intent. Not because of his uniform, or the way he wore it, or the particular straightness of his spine that spoke of a man who had made his backbone into architecture. It was the eyes. They were grey, and they were the most awake eyes she had ever seen in her life. Not sharp in the aggressive sense, but awake in the way of a man who had trained himself to see clearly and had never stopped, and who now carried that clarity like a lantern he could not put down. They moved over her face for exactly 2 seconds, and she had the unsettling sensation of being read, not her surface, not her dress, or her posture, or her careful neutral expression, but something beneath all of that. Something she hadn't offered. She maintained her composure. She had known that was the first test. "Miss Calloway." His voice was measured, a baritone that had been used to giving orders for so long that even a neutral greeting carried a kind of quiet authority. "Sit down." She sat. He held her letter of reference. "Mrs. Eleanor Marsh speaks highly of you. She is very kind. She says you managed her household in Charleston for 3 years before your mother's illness brought you back to Savannah." "Yes, sir." "And before that?" "I managed my family home on Abercorn Street from the age of 17, after my father left for the war." Something shifted in his expression, not softening exactly, but a reorientation, like a compass adjusting to true north after spending time near iron. "How old are you now, Miss Calloway?" 25. He set the letter down. "I'll be direct with you. My last housekeeper left because she found the position uncomfortable. Living in a household under military occupation, managing the intersection of military and domestic life, it requires a particular kind of practicality. I have no interest in ideology or politics within these walls. I have no interest in drama or sentiment. I require competence, discretion, and reliability." "I understand, sir." "Do you have any objection to working for a Union commander?" She met his eyes without blinking. "My objections are my own business, sir. My conduct is yours." He looked at her for a long moment. Then something happened that she had not anticipated. The corner of his mouth moved. Not quite a smile, but the shadow of one. The suggestion that a smile was a thing he was theoretically capable of, like a room that had been closed so long you almost forgot there was a door. "You start tomorrow," he said. The first 2 weeks were a study in discipline, hers and his. Vivienne learned the house the way a general learns terrain. Not just the geography of it, but the rhythm. She learned that General Hale rose at 5:30, not 6, and spent the first 30 minutes of his day at the window of his bedroom overlooking the park with a cup of coffee, a habit so private that she only discovered it by accident when she came upstairs early to address a leak in the ceiling of the hallway. She stopped herself in the corridor and stood very still and watched him through the open door, just his profile, the grey light of dawn on his face, the stillness of a man who was using those minutes to exist before the day required him to command. A man who was, in those 30 minutes, nobody's general and nobody's administrator, and simply a person standing in the early light of a city he was trying to hold together with the sheer force of his attention. She told herself she noted this because it was useful. She almost believed it. She learned Thomas too, the careful way he watched her, the questions he didn't ask directly, but embedded in small talk, the way he positioned himself between her and rooms she hadn't been invited into. He was not hostile, he was thorough. She respected that, even as she worked to give him nothing to find. She learned the 2 officers, Lieutenant Briggs, 22, eager and anxious, who left papers on his desk face up and talked too loudly about things he should have kept quiet, and Captain Aldridge, 35, methodical, who locked everything and said nothing that wasn't necessary. She noted Briggs as the weak point in the household security and felt briefly guilty about thinking that way. She noted the guilt, too, and filed it under evidence of a problem I'll address later. She had not yet found the letters Dupree wanted. She had not yet been alone in the study. What she had found instead were things she hadn't expected to find. A framed photograph on the general's desk of a woman and 2 young children, the woman's posture formal, the children's faces blurred by the long exposure time of the camera, but something in the way she held the smaller child suggesting tenderness. Vivienne had stood looking at it for longer than was strictly professional, noting the way the woman's hand curved around the child's shoulder, the unconscious grip of someone who held things with the awareness that they could be lost. She found out from Mrs. Prentice, without asking directly, that the general's wife and daughters had died of typhoid in 1862 while he was at the front. He had received the letter 6 weeks after the fact. He had been in the middle of a battle. She had carried that piece of information around inside her chest for 3 days, not sure what to do with it, not sure why it sat so heavily. It was on a quiet Thursday afternoon, while returning a stack of books from the parlor to the library, that Vivienne found the thing that changed everything, or rather, the thing that made her admit to herself that everything had already begun to change. She set the books on the shelf and was straightening the row when her hand found a gap, and she pulled the volume that had been pushed sideways to fill it. The spine read, "My Bondage and My Freedom." Frederick Douglas. She opened it carefully, expecting a clean interior, the kind of book kept for appearance rather than reading. What she found instead was a conversation. The margins were dense with penciled notes, not the neat annotations of an academic, but the urgent, cramped writing of someone reading in stolen hours, reacting in real time. Whole passages were underlined twice. Some had question marks beside them, not skeptical ones, she thought, but the marks of a man encountering an idea that demanded to be sat with. How does a system teach people that they are property, and then act surprised when it cannot quickly be undone? Someone had written in the margin beside a paragraph she couldn't see clearly, and lower on the page, pressed hard enough to indent the paper. The cruelty was not incidental, it was architectural. Vivienne stood very still. The room was quiet. The late afternoon light came through the library window at a low amber angle, illuminating the dust motes above the shelves and the worn spine of the book in her hands, and the careful, urgent handwriting of a Union general who had been asked to rebuild a society and had apparently decided that understanding its crimes was a necessary precondition for doing so. She had come into this house with a portrait already painted, cold, rigid, a man who administered rather than understood. She had held that portrait like a shield, because if she could keep him at the distance of an abstraction, a symbol of occupation, of the North, of loss, then what she was doing here was something she could justify. The book in her hands dissolved that shield. She was not naive. She knew that a man could hold complex ideas and still do damage. She knew that good intentions did not cancel bad policy, and she had seen enough of the occupation to know that the gap between what men believed and what they did was often very wide. But this was not the book of a man performing virtue. This was the book of a man in private conversation with a truth that was costing him something. She put it back exactly as she had found it, spine slightly inward, cover facing left. Her hands were steady, her breathing was not. That evening at dinner, a brief staff meal in the kitchen, the general having eaten alone in his study as he sometimes did when the paperwork was heavy, she found herself looking at the back of the door that led to the rest of the house and thinking a thought she immediately recognized as dangerous. I want to understand him, not as a target, not as an obstacle, as a person. She put the thought away. It came back. The test came on a Friday evening in her 4th week. General Hale was hosting a dinner for 3 civilian officials from Washington, men whose names Vivienne recognized from Dupree's world, men who moved in the space where politics and profit pressed together. She was helping manage the serving of the meal, and toward the end of the 2nd course, one of the Washington men, a florid, self-important man named Grayson, leaned toward her as she refilled his wine glass and said quietly, and with the particular confidence of a man who assumed women were decorative rather than attentive, "Tell me, my dear, does the general keep many documents in that study of his? We hear he's been collecting quite a correspondence." Vivienne's hand did not tremble. The wine poured perfectly, a dark ruby ribbon descending without a single wasted drop. "I wouldn't know, sir," she said, with the practiced vacancy of someone who had never had a thought worth examining. "I'm not permitted in the study without him present." From across the table, without any visible change in the direction of his attention, General Hale said, "Grayson, you'll find the quail is better eaten while it's hot." Grayson turned back to his plate. Vivienne moved to the sideboard. She did not look at the general, but she felt, with the particular skin-level awareness she had developed over 4 weeks of watching him, that he was looking at her. Not the surveillance look, the other one. The one she had no clean name for yet. The storm came in off the Atlantic on a Tuesday night in late October, the kind of storm that the Georgia coast manufactured out of pure determination. All wind and sideways rain and the sound of the live oaks outside the windows throwing themselves around like something was being fought. Vivienne was in the kitchen with Mrs. Prentice when the sound started, a low, cracking protest from the north side of the house, followed by the definitive crash of something large hitting the ground outside. The whole house flinched. The lamp above the kitchen table swung on its hook. One of the great oaks had come down. Its crown had clipped the north corner of the house, and the window of the small sitting room on the 1st floor had been driven inward by a falling branch. The glass was everywhere. Rain was coming in at an angle, soaking the curtains, the rug. the collection of military maps that had been unrolled on the table in preparation for the morning's briefing. Vivienne moved before anyone told her to. She had the lamps in her hands, grabbed from the hall sconces without breaking stride, and she was already pulling the window's interior shutters closed against the wind, her shoulder against the wood, the rain hitting the back of her hand through the gap like cold needles, when General Hale appeared in the doorway in his shirt sleeves, his collar undone, his hair displaced from its usual order. He looked like a man who had been woken from sleep and was not particularly bothered by it, or rather like a man for whom the difference between sleep and alertness was simply a question of which kind of attention was currently required. "The maps," he said. "Already," she said. He looked at the maps which she had lifted from the table and rolled back into their protective oilskin cases before the rain could reach them. He looked at her. The lamp she held threw shadows upward across both their faces, making the moment strange and close. She had a cut on her hand from the glass. She hadn't noticed it yet. He did. He crossed the room, took her hand without asking, not violently, but with the directness of a man who was used to making decisions quickly and did not see why tenderness required a different speed, and examined the cut in the lamp's light. It was shallow, a thin line across her palm already beading red. "It's nothing," she said. "It needs to be cleaned." He still had her hand. His grip was careful in a way that felt deliberate, like a man who had trained himself to be careful with things that could break, and applied that training without distinguishing between fragile objects and fragile people. "Come to the study." She thought very clearly in the space between one heartbeat and the next. This is the opportunity, the letters. She thought it the way she had been trained to think, cold and tactical and forward-facing. And then she became aware of the warmth of his hand around hers, and the thought dissolved into something more complicated than she had planned for. In the study, he found the medicine box with the efficiency of a man who had dealt with field injuries and considered a cut on a woman's hand a minor but addressable problem. He cleaned it with alcohol. She didn't flinch, which made him glance at her again in that reading way he had, and wrapped it in a narrow strip of clean linen. Outside, the storm raged. The house creaked around them like a ship in a sea it had not been built for. "You moved quickly," he said. He was securing the bandage's edge with a small, neat knot. "Before I got there, the maps were going to be ruined. You identified the priority correctly." He released her hand, but slowly, as if the releasing was its own small decision. He did not step back immediately. The study was small, the lamplight warm, and the storm had contracted the world down to this circle of light and the two people standing in it. "Why?" She looked up at him. He was closer than he'd been before. She could see the weather lines beside his eyes, the pulse at his jaw, the faint shadow of sleeplessness beneath his gaze. "Because they were clearly important." "How did you know?" "They were military maps, unrolled and marked. You had been working on them recently." She paused. "You care about this work." Something moved across his face, not the shadow of a smile this time, but something deeper and less controlled. A flicker of something that looked, for just a moment, like being seen by someone who understood what they were looking at. Not the general, not the administrator, the man who stood at the window at 5:30 and used 30 minutes of quiet to remember he was alive. He stepped back. "Get some sleep, Miss Calloway." She went upstairs and lay on her bed in the dark and listened to the storm and thought about the letters she had not looked for, and the hand that had held hers with such careful deliberateness, and the Douglas book with its urgent margins, and the photograph of the woman who held her child like something that could be lost. She thought about all of it, the way you think about evidence when the conclusion you're reaching is one you're afraid of. And she understood, with the clear, cold clarity of a woman who had been honest with herself all her life, that she was in very significant trouble. 3 days after the storm, Dupree sent a message through the network, a folded note tucked into the basket of produce delivered from the market, a trick she had been told to watch for. Progress. She burned it in her room's small fireplace and stared at the ash and thought about what progress meant and who it was supposed to serve. She had been in the household for 5 weeks. She had found no letters. This was partially strategy. She had not yet risked the study, and partially something else that she had not yet let herself name. The something else arrived at full confrontation on a Thursday afternoon. She was in the library, returning books that had been taken out to the parlor, when she overheard through the partially open study door a conversation that she had not been meant to hear. Captain Aldridge's voice, low and clipped. "The report from our informant in the sympathizer network, sir. It suggests someone may have been placed inside a Union household to gather intelligence." A pause. Hale's voice even. "How reliable is the informant?" "Reasonably. The description is vague. A woman, young, southern, placed as a domestic." The silence that followed had a texture to it, dense, like the air before another storm. "All right," Hale said finally. "Quietly, don't alarm anyone, and Aldridge, if it turns out to be true, I want to know before anyone else acts. Understood?" "Sir." Vivienne stood in the library with a book in each hand and felt the floor shift beneath her in a way that had nothing to do with gravity. He knew, or suspected, or would know soon enough. She had perhaps days. She set the books on the table very carefully, the way you set down something heavy when your arms are shaking. She breathed. She made herself think rather than panic. This was the discipline of survival, the thing she had built over 5 years in the ruins of everything she had expected her life to be. She had 2 choices. The first, act immediately. Get into the study tonight. Find the letters or prove they didn't exist. Leave before Aldridge's investigation landed on her name. Return to Dupree with something, anything, and let the Calloway house on Abercorn Street be her consolation. She tried to want this. She assembled the image of the house, the magnolia tree, the window her mother had watched from, and she held it in her mind and waited for it to be enough. It wasn't. The second choice was harder to look at directly, so she looked at it anyway, because she had always believed that the things you couldn't look at were the things that controlled you. The second choice was, tell him. She did not go to the study that night. She lay awake until 2 in the morning and stared at the ceiling and made herself sit with the full consequence of both choices, not rushing past the difficult parts, not softening them. If she stayed and said nothing, Aldridge would find her name eventually, and then she would have neither the house nor anything else. If she left, she would be protected, and for a time, by the network's ability to absorb and redeploy, but she would carry for the rest of her life the knowledge of what she had walked away from. Not just the house, the other thing, the larger, more dangerous thing that had no name she was yet willing to speak. And if she told him, she did not know. But she thought of a man in a study with a medicine box and a careful knot and grey eyes that stayed awake, even when everything else was quiet. And she thought of a book full of urgent handwriting, and she made her decision. She went the following morning. She knew he was in the house and knew where he was, and at his desk, working before breakfast, as he often did. She knocked. "Come in." He looked up when she entered. He was still in his undress uniform, the morning not yet fully shaped around him, and for a second she saw the man rather than the general, tired in the specific way of someone who has been carrying something heavy for a very long time, and has become so accustomed to the weight that he's forgotten what standing upright without it felt like. She closed the door behind her. The click of the latch was very loud. "I have something to tell you," she said, "and I would ask that you hear all of it before you make any decisions." He set his pen down. His face went very still in the way of a man who had just confirmed a suspicion but was controlling his response to it. He gestured to the chair across from his desk. She sat. She folded her hands in her lap. She met his eyes. And she told him everything. Not about the letters specifically. She had never found them, so there was nothing to confess there. But about Dupree, about the network, about the way she had been recruited and what she had been promised, and the debt against her mother's house that had made saying no feel impossible. She told him about her father at Chickamauga, about the letters she had managed for him, the way she had learned to put his words in order, to make his ideas legible on paper, about the war ending and the world ending at the same time, and the mathematics of a woman alone in 1865 with no property, no income and no choices that anyone had bothered to put in front of her. She told him about the boarding house room, about the winters, about the particular silence of a woman who has decided to survive and has accepted that survival would require things she had not been raised to consider. She did not apologize. She had spent a long time believing she should apologize for everything, for her father's choices, for her mother's death, for the Confederacy's sins, for the war, for surviving it. And she had eventually concluded that apologizing for things you did not choose was a form of self-erasure that helped no one and cost you everything. So she did not apologize for being recruited. She told the truth instead, and let the truth be what it was. When she finished, the study was quiet except for the sound of the house waking around them, footsteps on the floor above, the distant clatter of Mrs. Prentice in the kitchen, Thomas's voice somewhere in the hall giving morning instructions. Hale had not moved during her account except once, when she mentioned her father. A small adjustment in his posture, a slight lean forward that was quickly controlled, like a man who had started toward something and then remembered he wasn't supposed to move yet. "You found nothing," he said. It was not quite a question. "I was never alone in the study. I arranged that." The simplicity of it stopped her cold. She looked at him. He had known or suspected, and he had arranged to keep her out of the study not primarily to protect the documents, but to protect her from the consequences of finding them. The cold, rigid, administrative Union general who saw the South as a problem. The man who had kept her at a careful distance from evidence that would have forced him to act against her. She looked at him and thought of the book in the library. The cruelty was not incidental, it was architectural, and she thought that perhaps the kindness was not incidental either. "What happens now?" she said. "Now," he said, "is more complicated." He did not send her away. This was the first remarkable thing. The second was what he did instead, not with declarations or explanations, but in the language she had spent 6 weeks learning to read, the language of a man who said everything with actions and nothing with words. He called Thomas into the study and told him quietly that Miss Calloway would require an escort whenever she left the house, framed not as restriction, but as protection, delivered with the specific gravity of a man who understood the difference. He sent a message, she didn't know to whom, that she suspected was designed to give Dupree's network the impression that she was still embedded and undetected, still collecting, still safe and operational. He was, in a single morning, dismantling a trap that had been set around both of them, and he was doing it with the same efficiency he brought to field maneuvers: assess, prioritize, act. "You're protecting me," she said when they were alone again. "I'm managing a situation. From someone who was sent to spy on you." He looked at her directly, the full force of those grey eyes. "From someone who told me the truth when she didn't have to." She had been prepared for many things: dismissal, arrest, the cold courtesy of a man who would process her situation as a problem to be filed correctly and forgotten. She had not been prepared for that sentence. She felt it the way you feel a window opening in a room you thought was sealed. The days that followed had a different texture, the same house, the same routines, but with the pretense stripped away, and what was underneath was something neither of them had words for yet. They moved around each other with a new kind of care, like two people who had acknowledged the depth of the water they were standing in, and were being very deliberate about how they moved. She saw more of him. Not physically more, but more of the substance of him. She saw how he ran his morning meetings with the Freedmen's Bureau representatives, not the performative engagement of a man building his political reputation, but the attentive, quiet, sitting forward attention of someone who had decided these conversations mattered, and was prepared to let them take the time they needed. She watched him listen to an older freedman describe the problem of land title documentation, papers lost or burned or never properly recorded, and saw Marcus Hale pick up his pen and begin taking notes in the same compact, urgent hand she recognized from the Douglas margins. She began to help, not because it was her role, but because she was there and she had a mind and the work was immense, and it seemed wasteful to let competence sit idle when people needed things done. She began drafting correspondence, first the routine administrative letters, then gradually the more complex negotiations with local civil authorities who spoke in the coded language of Southern politics, full of courtesies that meant the opposite of what they said. She translated his precise military thinking into the social tongue of civilian diplomacy, threading the needle between what needed to be said and what could actually be heard by men whose pride was the most fragile thing in every room they entered. He read her drafts with the focused attention he brought to everything. He made small adjustments, a word here, a sentence restructured there, that told her not that she had been wrong, but that there were dimensions of the local situation she had not yet fully mapped. She read his corrections and learned from them, and noted the strange intimacy of learning from someone through the evidence of how they thought. "Where did you learn to write like this?" he asked one evening, looking up from the Augusta letter. "My father's correspondence. I managed it from 17. He was not a detail man." She paused. He was better at inspiring people than administering them. Hale looked at her with that quality in his eyes, the one that was like a lamp being carried closer, illuminating things that had been in shadow. "Most people are," he said. She thought about asking which one he was. She thought she might already know the answer, that he was both, and that the cost of being both was the weight she could see in his shoulders at the end of long days, the particular exhaustion of a man who did not separate his heart from his responsibility, and had long since accepted that this was going to cost him something. Dupree's network made contact again, 2 weeks after her confession. A woman at the market pressed a note into her hand. "What is taking so long?" She burned it. Then she told Hale. He was quiet for a moment, looking at something on his desk, his hands still, that particular stillness that was not inaction but contained action, the way a compressed spring is not inert. Then he said, "They're going to send someone else if they believe you've been compromised." "I know. I want you to write to Dupree. Tell him you've found what he's looking for. Arrange a meeting." She looked at him. "You're setting a trap." "I'm ending this." His voice was even, but she could hear the edge in it. Not anger at her, not at any person, but at the machinery itself, the networks and the resentments and the long shadow of a war that kept manufacturing consequences in the bodies of people who had not chosen it. "I'd rather do it without you being in the middle of it any longer. Without you being in the middle of it." She heard that sentence differently than he may have intended it, or perhaps exactly as he intended it. She was not sure anymore where intention stopped and meaning began with him. He was not a man who spoke carelessly. "And after," she said. He looked at her for a long moment. One of those moments where the thing being said was much larger than the words available to say it, where the whole weight of what had been built in 6 weeks of watching and learning, and slowly, carefully trusting, pressed against the thin wall of language and found it insufficient. "After," he said carefully. "We'll talk about after." The meeting with Dupree was arranged for a warehouse on the river, 2 nights later. Vivienne wrote the note with steady hands and a quieter conscience than she had expected. Hale's men were in position before Dupree arrived. It was not violent. She had been afraid it would be. She had spent the evening in her room with her hands pressed flat against the coverlet, breathing through the fear that something would go wrong and someone she cared about would be caught in the middle of it. She made herself acknowledge in the dark that she cared, not abstractly, specifically. Thomas, who watched over her with the thoroughness of someone who had decided she was worth the effort. Mrs. Prentice, who had started leaving an extra biscuit on the kitchen table every morning without ever saying why. And the man at the center of all of it, the man with the grey eyes and the careful hands and the library full of annotated books and the 30 minutes at the window every morning when he was no one's general and simply himself. Dupree was arrested along with 4 others. The network fractured but did not dissolve. Networks like that never do. They go underground and reconstitute. But its particular operation against Hale's command was finished, and the immediate danger that had been pressing against Vivienne like a wall at her back was gone. She felt its absence as a physical thing, a lightness, almost disorienting, as if she had been walking so long in the dark that the light made her blink. The letters were never found. Because they had never existed in the form Dupree believed, they were a rumor made flesh by the particular stubbornness of men who needed their enemies to be guilty in ways that justified their own resistance. What Hale kept in his safe were not compromising political documents. He showed her himself. He came to her one afternoon while she was in the library, walked in, opened the safe he had never before unlocked in her presence, and placed a stack of documents on the table in front of her without a word. She looked down at them. Letters, dozens of them written on all manner of paper, some formal, some barely legible, written by hands still learning the shape of their own names. Dear General Sir, I write to ask about my children who were taken in the year 1859, and another. We have the land, but not the paper. Please can someone help us get the paper? And another, in a child's large round letters. My mother says you helped my father find his sister. She says to say thank you. She read for a long time. The afternoon shifted around her, the light moving across the floor in its slow daily arc. When she looked up, he was standing at the window, not watching her, looking out at the park, giving her the privacy of the moment. But present, there if she needed the room to not be empty. This was what he had protected. Not intelligence, not political leverage. The record of people trying to become real to a system that had spent 2 centuries insisting they were not. Every letter was a person. Every person was a life that the war had fractured, and that someone, this man, this apparently cold and rigid administrator, had been quietly, methodically trying to help put back together. She understood now why he had stayed in Savannah when other officers had rotated out. She understood the Douglas book and its urgent margins. She understood the particular quality of his exhaustion, not the exhaustion of a man overburdened by a job, but the exhaustion of a man who had looked at a wound and decided that looking away was not something he was capable of. Why didn't you tell me? She said. He turned from the window. Would you have believed me? She thought about the woman who had walked into this house 6 weeks ago with a false letter of reference and a mission to betray the man who had just put the most human thing he owned in front of her. No, she said honestly. Not then. No, he agreed. Not then. Winter arrived in Savannah the way it always did, not with drama, but with a slow subtraction, the colors muting, the air thinning, the evenings pulling in like a held breath. Vivienne stood in the garden of the house on Forsyth Square on a December morning, her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee, looking at a sky the color of pewter, and allowed herself, for the first time in as long as she could remember, to feel something that was not urgency, not strategy, not the constant low hum of a woman calculating her next necessary move. She felt still, and the stillness was so unfamiliar it took her a moment to recognize it as peace. The legal charges had been quietly dropped. Hale had managed that without fanfare, without extracting any visible price for it, in the efficient, unannounced way he handled things he had simply decided to handle. The claim against the Calloway property on Abercorn Street had been settled through channels she had not asked him to access, and he had handed her the documentation with that same blunt directness one morning over coffee, placing it beside her cup without preamble. You didn't have to do this, she had said. No, he had agreed. She had looked at him. He had looked back. The document sat on the table between them like a sentence that had been waiting a long time to be completed. Marcus, she said. She had never called him that before. The word had lived in her mind for weeks without permission, and now it sat in the air between them like something made visible that had always been there. Something broke open in his face, not dramatically, not with any of the theater of lesser stories. It was quiet, the way a door opens that has been closed for a long time, and the room it opens onto is still there, just as it was, waiting. I don't know how to do this, he said. He said it without embarrassment, without apology, the bare honesty of a man who had decided that pretense was a luxury he couldn't afford. I stopped. When Sarah died, I stopped believing I knew how to do this. I told myself that was acceptable, that some things end and you adjust what you expect from your life. Sarah, his wife's name, in the air between them for the first time. I don't know how either, Vivienne said. I never quite learned the way I was supposed to. I was always watching instead of participating, reading the room rather than living in it. Then we're equally unqualified. Equally. The corner of his mouth moved. This time it completed itself, a real smile, slow and full and utterly disarming, the smile of a man who had kept it in storage for years and was tentatively checking whether it still worked. His whole face rearranged itself around it, the weather lines softening, the gravity briefly suspended, and she thought she had never in her life seen anything so unexpectedly, devastatingly good. She crossed the distance between them, 3 steps across the rug through the lamp's warm circle, and she took his face in her hands because she was done waiting for things to happen to her, had always been done with that, and she kissed him with the full weight of 6 months and 25 years and everything that had been burned and rebuilt and come through the fire still standing. He kissed her back. Both hands came up, one at her waist, one at the back of her head, not desperate, not urgent, but with the deliberateness of a man who had decided something and intended it completely. The way he did everything, like something he had been careful about, like something he intended to keep. Outside, Savannah continued its slow, complicated business of becoming something new, a city still tangled in old grief and new possibility, where freedmen built schools in the lots where slave markets had stood, and northern merchants argued with southern pride over the price of cotton, and the live oaks in the park stood exactly as they had for 200 years, indifferent to the arguments of men, patient as only very old things can afford to be. Spring, 1870. The magnolia tree in the garden of the Calloway house on Abercorn Street bloomed early that year, white flowers opening against the April sky with the decisive confidence of something that had always known it was going to bloom again, regardless of what the winters thought. Vivienne stood beneath it in the morning light. The house had been repaired over the winter, not restored to what it had been, because what it had been was gone, and neither she nor Marcus had any particular interest in recreating ghosts, but made into something new that still carried the bones of the old thing and was better for it. The front steps had been rebuilt in fresh pine that still smelled of sawdust on warm afternoons. The garden had been cleared and replanted. Practical things alongside the beautiful ones, the way she had decided most things in her life should be arranged now. She was Mrs. Hale. She had been since February, in a small ceremony in the parlour of the Forsyth house with Thomas and Mrs. Prentice as witnesses and a judge who had looked mildly baffled by the whole arrangement, and then decided, wisely, that it was none of his business. There had been no grand event, no announcement in the Savannah morning news, no parade of social opinions that she had not asked for. Just the two of them in the parlour, in the morning light, saying words that meant what they said. She had cried briefly and without embarrassment, which surprised her. She had not thought she was someone who cried at ceremonies. She had discovered she was someone who cried at things that were real, at the specific, irreducible weight of a moment that could not be taken back or rewritten. Marcus had held her hand through the whole of it with the grip of a man who understood that some things, once committed to, you simply did not let go. He came through the garden door now with 2 cups of coffee, his jacket still unbuttoned in the way of early mornings when the day had not yet required him to become entirely official. His hair was slightly disordered. She had not told him, because she had decided that the particular way it looked in the morning was something she wanted to keep for herself, a small private knowledge in a life that had always given her information as a survival tool and was only now beginning to give it to her as a gift. He handed her the coffee and stood beside her and looked up at the magnolia. "Your mother planted this," he said. He asked because she had mentioned it once months ago, and he remembered. He always remembered. "The year I was born." He was quiet for a moment, a good quiet, the kind that had weight and warmth in it rather than absence. Then, "She would have had opinions about me." "Extremely strong ones," Vivienne agreed. "Delivered within the first 10 minutes of meeting you, possibly the first 5. "I would have liked that." She looked at him sideways, the weathered profile, the careful jaw, the grey eyes turned upward toward the white blossoms overhead. He meant it completely and without irony. The man who had spent years being assessed and opposed and argued with had no fear of a strong opinion. "She would have liked you," Vivienne said. "Eventually, she was difficult to win over. So are you." "I know." She leaned into his shoulder, the way she had been doing for months now, with the ease of something practiced, something that had found its shape. "You managed it anyway." He put his arm around her, his hand warm at her waist, and she felt the familiar solidity of him, the particular quality of a person who has decided to be present and is not performing it, who stands beside you the way the live oaks stand in the park, not dramatically, not temporarily, simply there in the specific and sufficient way of things that intend to remain. The magnolia released its petals around them, slow as snow, soft as mercy, each one descending in its own unhurried arc toward the earth below. Somewhere in the city, a church bell rang the hour. Somewhere on Bay Street, the Freedmen's Bureau office was opening its doors to the first of the day's long line of people who needed something recorded, something found, something made real by the authority of paper and ink. Somewhere in the house behind them, Thomas was briefing the morning's correspondence with his customary precision, and Mrs. Prentice was making biscuits that were, by any objective measure, worth the distance she had traveled to make them. The world was broken and busy and stubbornly, impossibly alive. And here, in this garden, beneath a tree that had been planted in the year of a girl's birth, and had survived everything the intervening years had sent against it, fire, grief, war, winter, and the particular damage that humans do to each other when they believe what they have is worth more than what someone else's. Two people stood in the morning light and did not need to speak. They stayed there until the coffee went cold, and the sun climbed higher, and the magnolia petals lay scattered on the grass around their feet like small white surrenders. Not of defeat, but of the kind that comes at the end of a very long fight, when you finally set down what you have been carrying and look at the person beside you and understand that arriving here at this specific, ordinary, irreplaceable morning was the whole point. Then they went inside together and began the day.
In a house of shadows and candlelight, she walked in wearing borrowed lies, silver pins in her dark brown hair, trying not to feel his eyes. The war was over, but not the pain. Savannah still remembered flames. He wore silence like a soldier's coat. She carried ghosts without a name. But somewhere between the storm and dawn, sent to break his guarded heart, but love had already torn her apart. And in the quiet where the wounded stay, he became her home anyway. A book with worn and trembling pages, letters hidden safe from war, not secrets made to ruin nations, but broken souls he fought for. And every time he took her hand, careful like fragile glass, she forgot the mission waiting, forgot the shadows of the past. Two lonely hearts in a world undone, still choosing not to run. Oh, magnolia petals in the morning light, falling slow like surrender after fight. She was sent to break his guarded heart, what war could not erase. Under the magnolia tree, they finally laid their burdens down and began again.